Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of our conversation regarding the stakeholder input to the Southwestern Public Service Integrated Resource Plan. I'm Margie Tatro. I'm here with my colleagues Jay Griffin and Deborah Shields from GridWorks, and we are recording this meeting as we did yesterday for the sake of those who'd like to rehear segments of the conversation or people who could not attend today. As normal, our meeting materials are loaded on the gridworks.org website, and I'll call your attention to an update of the SPS slide deck that Ben, Elsie, and team shared yesterday. A few corrections were made, and the new version is posted on the website. So if you'd like materials there, feel free to access that at any time. And so at this point, let me just describe our plan for today. We'd like to continue the conversation about the modeling results that the team shared yesterday, any observations, insights, follow-up questions that you all have. And I know the SPS team has also worked on some follow-ups that they wanted to provide to the group today. So thank you all for working diligently at that overnight. Then we will hear an update on the definition and parameters for the stakeholder requested modeling runs. And that will take us to a break where we will then discuss the results of the little worksheet survey that many of you responded to yesterday evening and this morning. Thank you so much. We'll describe the results from that. And then we'll review our next steps. We'll ask you again to do a survey of how this particular set of meetings worked for you or did not work for you. And we'll adjourn by noon. So with that, I'll point out that Deb Shields has put into the chat the link again to the meeting materials. If you need that, please feel free to access that at any time. I see a comment from Linda. I will read that here after we get started. It looks like something passed along from Jennifer Grasham. Thank you. So let me now turn the meeting over to Jay Griffin to moderate this next segment. Any follow-up from discussion of yesterday. So Jay, over to you.
Great, thank you, Margie. Good day, everyone. Just looking at who we have in the room here. I know we had, okay. So we've designated some time this morning as one for follow-up questions and discussion from the presentation yesterday. We were expecting things to actually spill over. So we'll see how much time is necessary there. We do have one slide that Ben and his team have put together, a follow-up question to Athena or her request to help, that I think will help explain how the accreditation methodology for solar plus storage. So we'll turn to that in a second. Then we'll double check again, see if there's any further questions from people. Thanks for discussion. And then I've just posted here a couple thought discussions for our follow-up after that. So Ben, I think I'm going to turn it over to you, and we have a joining here. I think Chris will be displaying the slide and you're going to explain it.
Perfect. Thank you, Jay. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Just first a quick apology. For some reason, my video is not working this morning, so I'm going to save everyone from having to look at me. And also, I'm unable to share my screen, so just bear with us if it takes a little bit longer. So, Chris, if you don't mind just bringing up that additional slide. You
should see it.
I can see it. Thank you, Chris. Do you mind making it full screen?
Of course. My functions aren't working.
Okay, we can work from here then. There you go. Even better. Perfect. So we put this together this morning in response to some questions, I think, from Athena yesterday. So first of all, when we talk about solar plus storage and kind of the combined accredited capacity of those two resources, we need to make a couple of assumptions, which is kind of on this opening sentence here. One is kind of the size of the solar facility compared to the size of the battery. And then also, what's the transmission capability of that site? And I'll talk about both of those individually. So what we're seeing seems to be kind of, I don't want to say the industry standard, but certainly what we saw in our most recent RFP was the solar facility being about twice the size of the battery. So if you have a 100 megawatt solar plant, then the battery was around about 50 megawatts, so about 50% of the solar size. So that's the first assumption we have to make, is what size is the battery. And then the second assumption is, when the developer of the project went to SPP and did their transmission interconnection study or their transmission network upgrade costs, what was the capability they can inject into the system at any one point in time? So what we usually see is they're kind of sizing that POI capability at the same size as the solar facility. So what that means is, at any one point in time, this joint facility that combined has 150 megawatt potential can only inject 100 megawatts at any one point in time. So that's the assumptions we've made in this graph. It would be a 100 megawatt solar facility, a 50 megawatt 4-hour lithium-ion battery. And I'll start with this graph on the right. This was the graph I presented yesterday. So these are the individual resources on their own. This graph on the left is the solar in the light yellow, and the orange here is the battery energy storage. Now, keep in mind, the vertical axis on this graph is not a percentage. This is megawatts. So what we see is the solar facility, which is in yellow, is getting 62-ish megawatts, declining over time, and that will match the graph exactly on the right. So you should see the yellow bar chart would match the yellow line chart. The storage is getting the same percentage as the orange graph on the right. Now, keep in mind, Lou, the solar facility, the battery facility is 50 megawatts, not 100 megawatts. So it's getting 90% of 50 megawatts, and that's why the numbers aren't quite as large as you'd expect. So now what you see is you just simply add the two together. So the accreditation of the solar added to the accreditation of the battery. But because you can never inject more than 100 megawatts into the system at any one time, you can't claim more than 100 megawatts of accreditation. So that dark blue line across at the 100 megawatts actually shows in the first 3 or 4 years of operation, the joint accreditation of a solar plus, this hypothetical solar plus battery project would be capped at 100 megawatts. And then as the accreditation for each of these individual resources decline, you would continue to maintain the maximum of just adding them together as long as you weren't exceeding that 100 megawatt cap. So hopefully that helps explain how the sum of the parts work. But Athena, if you have any follow-up questions or anyone else has any follow-up questions, happy to answer them now.
And that's very helpful. I don't see Athena in the room, so I'm not sure if she has any questions, but we'll toss that to the group here. Are there any further follow-up questions on this example?
Jay, this is Cynthia. Good morning, Ben. This is really helpful. Thank you. And then if you expand this to include wind resources, then as the solar declines, adding wind with storage as well, then helps you continue to optimize the system as a whole and have your output from wind and solar as high as possible. Is that right?
Yeah, so if you did what we call the trifecta, and you have wind, solar, and batteries all behind a single point of injection, you would simply add the blue line to these bar graphs, and it would push the accreditation up even further. So you'd have kind of a blue bar at the bottom, then the yellow, then the orange. The one thing you need to just be a little bit careful when you start doing the trifecta is it maximizes the accredited capacity of a site by having all three technologies there. but you start having to keep an eye on how much energy you're going to be curtailing. Because if you can only ever inject 100 megawatts of energy into the system in this example at any one given point in time, if you have wind, solar, and storage all at that same site, you may be curtailing or clipping some energy. So certainly can be done, but you just need to be pretty careful when you're looking at that optimal mix between getting the maximum amount of accredited capacity versus the most amount of energy benefits.
Okay, and I hadn't thought about it all at one site. I was thinking more dispersed throughout your territory. So if you had solar battery, one location, but then wind battery, another location.
Oh yeah, and in that case, Cynthia, then this graph would just be the same approach, but rather than the yellow line here, the yellow bar charts, you would just replace these with a blue bar chart, which would start around that kind of that 13, 15% you see on the right-hand chart. So everything would drop down.
Right. And so that's why we work with wind and solar and storage.
Correct.
Thank you. I really appreciate this graph. Thank you. Chart.
Absolutely.
Any other follow-up questions on the chart and the discussion? We have a few more in the chat, so please, people, keep them coming. Follow up to the presentation yesterday. See, hearing none at the moment. Cynthia, you asked the first question here in the chat. Do you want to go ahead and ask it here?
Ben, did you yesterday state that for the New Mexico jurisdiction, SPS would not be acquiring new gas gen?
No, in the runs we've done to date for the New Mexico jurisdiction, so the two we presented yesterday, which was the existing technologies and the long duration storage case, in neither of those cases did we allow new gas generation. So in the cases we presented yesterday, that's correct, no new gas.
Okay.
But we are going to be modeling an additional case where we do the hydrogen conversion and or carbon capture. And in that case, we will allow new gas with a pathway to become carbon free in line with the Energy Transition Act.
Okay, but then in terms of future or near-term RFPs, you would also then allow gas to hydrogen conversion to bid in, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, okay, or you would build it yourself.
Yeah, and in Cynthia, just to be clear, even if we were to build it ourselves, we would still bid into the RFP.
Right, exactly. So okay, I just wanted to make sure. I thought I'd heard you say no new gas, New Mexico, and I thought, I didn't think that was correct.
No, just in the cases we presented yesterday, that's where that's limited to.
Ben, maybe just to be crystal clear on that, I think in your last slides for 2030, you showed I think it was a 1,380 megawatt firm dispatchable requirement, and the RFP would basically allow other technologies that could meet that, but that would be the target. Is that a fair interpretation?
Based on that one, yeah. So based on that modeling run, Chris, do you mind going down to slide 41, please? Thank you. So yeah, based on kind of the 3 runs that we've done today, and obviously we're going to do many more runs, but if we just limit it to the ones we've looked at, the RFP essentially would seek in the region of the 1380 to 1670 megawatts of dispatchable generation. Now that could be made up of storage, it could be made up of gas with a carbon-free future ahead of it, it could be long duration storage, it could be any technology that provides dispatchable load following type benefits.
Okay, great. Cynthia, does that clarify? Okay. Jeffrey Pollock, you had a follow-up question for yesterday.
Yes, we talked about the levelized cost of energy and how it was going to be modeled. I think, Ben, you said that for the renewable resources, the levelized cost of energy would be modeled as that in the modeling. I guess my question says, what about, and I said dispatchable in the question, but I think I really meant firm peaking. Will the capital costs for firm peaking resources be similarly modeled on a levelized cost basis? If not, how are you going to do that?
Yeah, so we model the dispatchable resources using a similar approach, but rather than use a levelized cost of energy, we use a levelized cost of capacity. So an LCOC metric. Essentially, Jeff, it's the same approach as we described yesterday, but you're converting everything to a dollar per kW year as opposed to a dollar per megawatt hour.
Like the levelized cost of energy calculation assumes the equal amount of capital costs recovered over the life of the facility.
Correct.
Okay. All right. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks. I just put another request for any further follow-up questions to yesterday's presentation or the slide that Ben showed this morning. I'll look around. Please put your hand up. Okay, not hearing anything. I did offer a couple of thoughts, questions for further discussion on the presentation. Just one general one. I was curious what people found exciting about what we saw yesterday. See, hopefully we can get someone to speak up. As exciting as you can get about resource modeling, I thought there were some pretty encouraging things. Curious to see what people think.
Let's face it, it's not an exciting process.
It's important though. True.
It's very important. It's just not very exciting.
This is Cynthia. I wouldn't say exciting, but I was just so pleased that Ben and his team once again have put so much thought and been so patient with explaining and reviewing information and data with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Cynthia. And it's always very challenging putting together these presentations. I never know how much level of detail to get into. And, as people said, it's not the most exciting presentation in the world. So if there's any feedback, if there's any people who want to see particular data sets, particular pieces of information, just let us know. And in the August 29th meeting, we'll certainly do our best to accommodate any requests.
Well, thank you for that, Cynthia. Any other comments from the group? Things they thought we can use interesting as well, but exciting. Jeffrey, do you have anything you wanted to offer?
Well, I think it's pretty interesting to see how much nameplate capacity is having to be added to keep the system whole. And I think that should really be a kind of a wake-up call in terms of the physical capacity to install that much nameplate capacity and the resources required to me should be very thought-provoking in our discussions.
Maybe the question should be, what keeps you up at night when you see this versus excites you?
Do you want to offer what kept you up last night?
Well, this didn't keep me up last night. I slept great, but it's just be interesting to see. I imagine SPS has never had a procurement need like this before, and that would be somewhat daunting given what we've seen with delays and supply chain issues and permitting, and so a lot of challenges there that still would have to be overcome.
This is Cynthia again, along with what Jeff and David we're both stating what I was thinking about yesterday evening is just then the potential magnitude of the revenue requirement in the both near and long term, and what could possibly be done to mitigate some of the rate impact and smooth out that revenue requirement over time. And I was interested in the notion that Ben mentioned yesterday of being able to extend for another year or two some of the gas units. I know we're going carbon free, but at the same time, also thinking about rate impact.
Ben, maybe, I think I hear a couple of questions there. One, and I think this is what I was trying to allude to late yesterday as well, just the magnitude of work that needs to be done here to meet some of these targets. And just well, all the project management, the logistics needed to get that done. I think you ticked through a number of kind of mitigation steps SPS can take. And then two, I think David said this at the very end, we haven't actually seen the economic results. Cynthia was alluding to the revenue requirement impact. And so maybe can you speak to what that looks like? Because my understanding is a lot of the generation that was added was there to save on fuel. So some portion of this is actually going to save, but where that balance lies, I think we actually haven't seen that yet. So Ben, can you speak to those?
Sure, and I purposely did not include the kind of the financial impacts for yesterday's meeting just because I was already upon time with the presentation we had, and I felt like the financial impact is going to be at least a 4-hour discussion. But maybe just to go back to David's comment, he may have slept well last night, but I mean, this does keep me up at night. I mean, this is a huge ask, a huge transition that we're going to be, embarking on in the next 2 years, for, solving the resource needs for the next 7 years. But I'd maybe get Chris to go, if you don't mind. Chris, are you still presenting?
I don't think he's sharing a screen now, but can we ask, is there a particular slide you want him to share?
Yeah, now that Margie's
Yeah,
up there, you can share.
Okay. Chris, if you can just go up to the results from the multi-jurisdictional baseline and the resources that were added.
Okay, can you see my screen, Ben?
Yep.
Yes, I can.
Up to, am I getting warm?
Yeah, keep going up. Go up a couple more, maybe. Let's go stop here, if you don't mind. Go down one more. Sorry, there's a slight delay, Chris. So slide 22. So what we're looking at here, I think, Jay, maybe this is to your point, are the resources that are being added economically to the portfolio. So in other words, if you did not put any constraint on the model, we kind of set aside the RPS go, set aside the ETA, and just said, Encompass select the lowest cost portfolio of resources. This is what the model comes up with. So you'd still see quite a substantial build out of renewable energy coming in. And if you go to the next slide, Chris, sorry, to 23. Go down, sorry, one more. This is it, perfect.
Yeah.
So even under the most economical case, you still see a very large build out of wind generation by the end of this decade. Potentially that could be a bit more of a mixture between wind and solar, as I said yesterday, depending on the results that come in from the RFP. But what you see here is new gas being added to the system. Now, if you don't add that new gas to the system and you end up replacing it with 4-hour batteries, you can come down, Chris, to this corresponding slide, but maybe 10 slides later. Going down. Okay, let's stop here just real quickly.
One more up.
Just on 29, please. There you go. what we're seeing, if you take away gas from the mix, is about an extra 5,000 megawatts of nameplate resources. So by not having gas there, you need to overbuild the system to account for the fact that you've got limited duration energy. The incremental gains that you get from energy production isn't huge. You're already very renewable heavy in the base case where you allow new gas. So in this case, yes, you're increasing renewable generation, if you go to the next slide, Chris, by a few percent.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
And if you go,
Let me just-
sorry to jump around in, Chris, if you go to the next slide.
Okay.
Sorry, go one more. Okay. You are increasing your renewable penetration slightly, but what you start seeing is you're getting quite a significant increase in cost, and I'm talking on a present value basis, billions of dollars, somewhere between $1 billion to $3.5 billion, depending on the scenarios in which you run, to get that incremental benefit from going away completely from gas to battery energy storage. So that's why when Cynthia asked the question earlier is, do you see us issue an RFP with no new gas? And I think our answer is no. We would probably look at a scenario in which we do allow gas generation with a carbon-free future, because essentially you have this huge difference in resource mix if you rely solely on 4-hour batteries to provide you dispatchable generation. So I guess, Jay, I'm kind of skirting around the issue, but what I'm really saying is if you look at the two scenarios and consider these bookends, you've got the difference between 15,000 megawatts of generation nameplate to 20,000 megawatts of generation. In the incremental benefits for energy production from carbon-free sources is on the smaller side, and it comes with a hefty price tag. So that's why I think it's very, very important as we start looking from 2028 through 2042, that we're really looking for that next technology. We really need that technology that, as I mentioned in a previous meeting, I called it the unicorn technology. That's economic, it's firm and dispatchable, and it's also carbon-free. And we do not want to put all of our eggs in one basket today and say that's going to be 4-hour batteries or that's going to be hydrogen. It needs to be kind of an open mind going into the next decade where we have each of those paths available for us as we see how the economics of these projects improves.
So Ben, it would be fair to say that you're looking to do maybe a more diverse mix of resources and not trying to pull all your eggs in one basket, if I could quote you.
That would be prudent planning, Jeff. Is, in the old days, we would talk about diversity, fuel diversity. I don't think that concept changes just because we're tending to go away from fossil fuels. I still think we need diversity within the mix. Now, that diversity could be wind and solar as opposed to, as we're seeing here, heavily on wind. So maybe it's wind and solar, some batteries, some hydrogen conversions. But again, the concept of diversity is still a prudent resource planning path to take.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think this, I would, and when I did resource plan, I came up against this too, is like a resource plan model will just choose the one resource that's even $1 cheaper, right? And so what this shows is like, what I would see is like way too much concentration on wind, right? Which can be much more fickle, it can be much more up and down, and you get wind droughts, and so you want more diversity in your portfolio. But just the modeling architecture in this case is just doing what it does is just minimizes cost, right? And this is actually not, from a risk perspective, this is not the portfolio you would want, I would think.
No, and David, I want to be very clear. When we're starting to look at these, if we were today saying, hey, we have to come up with the portfolio of resources that we are 100% going to build, and it wasn't subject to a future RFP, then the parameters of this modeling would be very different. We would be looking much more of the kind of the hourly, inter-hourly reliability constructs. We'll be looking at trying to provide a more diverse portfolio. I think what we're trying to just do at this stage of the level, this stage of the analysis, is to identify, first of all, what our capacity and what our energy needs are. What's the statement of needs going into the end of this decade? And then we're kind of identifying using, I would say kind of stress testing the model, using certain assumptions to see kind of what the range of resources would be to fulfill that need. Once you start seeing those resources bid into an RFP and you start seeing really what's in front of you, then to your point, David, you really need to do that deeper dive. You need to say, okay, if wind really does come back $5 lower cost than solar and the portfolio is going to be 100% wind, what's the incremental cost of adding, say, solar generation or batteries or hydrogen to give you slightly more expensive system, but a much more reliable, robust and resilient system? So all of that actually will be taken into account, partly in the IRP, but also it's going to be a big emphasis on that when we look at the RFP also.
So Ben, in addition to looking at lowest cost, the portfolios are looking to provide a certain amount of accredited capacity. Is that the only metric you're going to be looking at to determine whether a portfolio provides the same amount of reliability as another portfolio, or are you going to look at other metrics?
No, so there's one additional metric we're looking at, even in kind of this more high level first pass analysis, and that's expected unserved energy. So we don't need to be just resource adequate in terms of meeting our plan and reserve margin. We need to also make sure we have enough generation in any given hour to serve load within that hour. Then I think as you start identifying the actual resources that you're going to select from an RFP, then you go even one step further and you start saying, okay, now looking at this portfolio of resources, that's the lowest cost. Where are my risk points? Do I see if I'm 80% wind generation, do I have enough diversity in my resource portfolio? Instead, what happens if I switched out one of those wind resources and brought in, say, a solar resource? Maybe the incremental cost is only an extra $2 million on a PVR basis, but maybe now I've got 5% more on-peak generation. I'm not so heavily reliant on wind. So you would do all of that analysis, Jeff, after the fact, once you could weigh up the costs versus weighing up the benefits.
Right. But if we're going to compare plans on an apples and apples basis, don't each of the resource portfolios have to have not only meet the required accredited capacity, but essentially provide the same or very similar expected unserved energy in order to provide an apples and apples comparison? Yes,
that's exactly correct. We will, and that's what I said, we look at EUE, so expected unserved energy. We look at EUE, easy for me to say, as part of this analysis. And if we see a scenario has unserved energy, we will go back in and re-optimize the model to resolve that issue. So we will absolutely, based on weather normalized load forecast and the existing production profiles we have, we will resolve the EUE issue from the IRP perspective. I guess what I'm saying, Jeff, is in addition to that very important step, when we actually look at the RFP, we'll then be looking not just at solving EUE as it's projected to be, but what happens if we have extreme cases? Maybe we have a transmission outage, we can't import so much from the SPP. Maybe we have too much reliance on one technology over another. So we kind of do that deeper dive before making our recommendation of the final portfolio.
Or maybe you don't have normal weather.
Sorry, Jeff, I was speaking over you, my apologies.
Oh, I'm sorry. Or maybe you don't have normal weather. Is that another stress test you're going to look at?
Yes. So that's another thing we would look at when we come to do our recommendation, would be extreme weather scenarios.
And I just wanted to clarify one thing. That additional reliability analysis, is that, I think I heard two things, partly the review of these portfolios and partly in the evaluation of projects in portfolio in the RFP. I guess how much on the first one on the IRP side, how much more work is done here and when?
So from the IRP side, all of the models that we do are going to meet what I consider to be the two main reliability constructs. Everything we do in IRP is going to meet the plan and reserve margin requirement, which is our demand reliability metric set by SPP. And then also we are going to limit expected unserved energy. So every single portfolio We will review, see how much expected unserved energy is, and we will make adjustments to the resources being added, excuse me, to solve any EUE. So that's all being done as part of the IRP analysis. All I was saying, Jeff, is, Jay, excuse me, when we come to do the RFP analysis, we're then, once we've identified the actual resources that we're going to be recommending and know exactly what they cost, we're then going to take that same analysis and essentially do it on steroids. And we're really going to stress test some additional assumptions and see what the additional cost is.
Okay, that's helpful. I do want to give an opportunity for the PRC staff to speak or weigh in on anything that you've heard or any thoughts from your side. I believe the leader is Ed. Ed, do you have any thoughts, comments, questions you want to share and add, reflect on so far?
I'm pleased with the process that we're going through, and I think Cynthia has been really good in terms of putting together a list of questions and keeping me apprised and working through this. So thanks for that.
Okay.
Jay,
Go ahead, Ben.
sorry, Jay, do you mind if I just add one more thing? So I don't think I ever answered. I'm not sure if it's a question from Cynthia or maybe just a comment, but we talked about, you know, potentially extending some gas steam units. You know, I can give an example of how we would do that. We've just done that in our 2022 RFP, and this kind of ties into what Jeff was just saying also. We looked at what the model would do to solving the lowest cost portfolio possible. And the model added incremental generation to meet our expected unserved energy and also to meet our PRN. What we then did was look at the incremental cost of extending a very small gas steam unit. And essentially that was marginal. There's pretty much no cost to extending that for another couple of years. Just doing that extension provided additional reliability benefits. And we decided, you know, when we filed our CCN case, that would be something we were, you know, including in that recommended portfolio. So we will absolutely do that as we start looking at these analyses next year. Just because Encompass takes a certain course of action, we then go retrospectively and say, is there any additional actions SPS Xcel Energy can take that's going to improve reliability to the system, potentially at a small incremental cost or potentially at no marginal increase in cost. So that's something we will continue to do and we have done in the past.
Thanks for coming back to that, Ben. I guess, Cynthia, you brought up a couple of questions, but fundamentally your concern is about the revenue requirement impact. Is that Ben's covered, at least how that's being addressed here?
It's a good start. It's something we all get to look at and figure out how to have, you know, reliable and affordable energy.
Let's see, I don't see any other questions in the chat. I just had one other, other thoughts or things that the SPS team should take under consideration as we go into the additional steps of modeling here. Any other parting thoughts on what we've seen so far?
And Chris, perhaps you can slide up to the slide that shows the overall modeling steps to help inform this conversation. Yeah, and there was one a little even earlier that had check marks on things that the team has already completed. Yeah, great. That might help the conversation, Jay.
So Ben, you'd run through this. The ones with the checks are what you did and have presented, and these other ones are coming in our next meeting. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. So the ones for the check marks are the ones we presented yesterday. So again, just to reiterate, we presented the multi-jurisdictional baseline that included new gas. And then we presented the existing technologies, which is just wind, solar, lithium-ion batteries. And I clarified yesterday, existing technologies really means existing commercially available technologies. And then we also modeled the long duration storage. And as I mentioned yesterday, the model did not select any long duration storage. So we're going to do a sensitivity where we force in the long duration battery. We did all of those sensitivities under the financial forecast to date, which is our most conservative load forecast. We're going to do a higher load forecast and then a high electrification load forecast. Everything we presented yesterday was under the base gas assumption. We're going to be doing the low gas and a high gas analysis. And then we included $400 a kW transmission network upgrades. We're also going to do a $600 kW transmission network upgrade scenario. What you're going to see with each of these sensitivities is they're really going to move those bookends. So let's just take the 600 kW transmission network upgrades. What you're probably going to see is just less resources in that case. So the wind that was being added because it provides economical energy. If you make the transmission network upgrades higher, the wind's going to be less economical. It's still going to add wind, still needs the wind to provide energy in capacity when needed. But any wind that's being added just for economic energy purposes may drop off. So you're going to see less resources in that case. On the flip side, when we start looking at a high load forecast case, you're probably going to see more resources being added to meet our increased demand and energy forecasts. So again, really just kind of informing those bookends of kind of the minimum resource requirement and then the maximum resource requirement for next year's RFP.
Thanks for that overview. And unless we have any further questions, I think we're going to transition to Chris here, and he's going to run through the work that SPS has done in preparing to the stakeholder requested scenarios. So I'll pause for a second, just give anyone else a chance. And without that, well, seeing that we have no further questions, Chris, let's transition to your presentation if you're ready.
Yeah. So I feel like I've been doing a better job of just kind of Vanna Whiting this thing and pointing around to the slide. So I'll continue to do that. But what I'm presenting is the amount of the responses we received, the model requests we received from the stakeholders. We got a really good response from the stakeholders. I think we received 7 or 8 requests, and some of those had various parts or subparts to them. So I'm just going to summarize what we received, touch on what Excel plans to do, SPS plans to do to represent these modeling requests as proxies in some cases, and as actual model input adjustments that we'll make to represent these modeling requests. But again, we got a great response from the stakeholders, so we appreciate everybody providing requests that you did. We'll touch on those. Anything that I misrepresent here, we can talk about and move forward. But we have not, just to be clear, we've not run any modeling based on some of these requests. By virtue of our base, our level 0 or level 1 or level 2 models that we've run, we've kind of covered some of these, but there may be a little bit more work to be done that a stakeholder might want us to push the lever on a little bit more. So make some adjustments on my screen. My Zoom keeps popping up and disappearing. So, okay. Can everyone see my screen? Jay, can you see?
Yep.
Okay.
So, yep. Yes.
So we'll just start with Jim's request. He requested this distributed energy sort of type of a modeling request. There are really 3 categories that we received, kind of a demand side or demand response or distributed energy. So a lot of those we're going to try to bucket and bring together, just kind of put them in that category of modeling. We also got some supply side requests, and then we've got some early compliance requests. So there's really 3 buckets that we received in the groups of requests we got. So Jim asked for he'd be interested in modeling a battery powered virtual power plant program similar to the pilot program by the New Hampshire Electric Cooperative. And Jim provided a couple of references for us to go digest, which we did. Brian Setting from our team went out, did some research there, and is going to help us scope this up for our modeling. But the radials that that Jim would like us to run this under is the existing PRM at 15%. That high load case we keep talking about, base market and gas forecasts, base upgrade cost for transmission network upgrades at 400 kW and inclusive of long storage duration. So if you keep in mind everything Ben spoke of yesterday and today, we need really kind of proxy representations of these sorts of programs in a realistic kind of scope so that we can evaluate what it would look like to do such a program and then go out and have good conversations about it. We can't assume that our entire system goes to 4,500 megawatts of demand response and say that we're good. We've got to have realistic conversations, just like we were talking about a bit ago about quantitative versus qualitative analysis that we have to do. So essentially what I'm saying is that we've got to establish proxies within the model that represents a program that we can go take and have conversations around, and then bring that back for the modeling to kind of tweak it and improve what we think the cost improvements could be. So for this particular request, Jim, we plan to model it as a DER, demand energy response, or kind of a supply side resource, but it would be a selectable resource and Encompass capable of providing an equivalent of 5% of New Mexico total residential and small commercial and industrial sales. We will use the NREL ATB data that we've been talking about to represent that distributed energy resource. And that cost would be what the modeling would use as its proxy for what this program could look like. So again, 5% of our total residential and small C&I sales would be carved out, and this resource would be allowed by the model to select to serve that load. If the model does not select, similar to our long storage duration that we talked about yesterday and a little bit today, if the model does not select it, we will force the model to select it, and we can look at the difference between the PBRRs to see if there's some value in trying to further detail the scope to see if there's some benefits of either increasing the percentage, decreasing the percentage, etc. So any questions on that one, Jim? Assuming Jim's on stage.
Jim is here. Jim, you have questions, comments? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate you looking to model that. Just a point of clarification, I did mention the New Hampshire Electric Cooperative as one model, but there's also another model I believe I mentioned, which is a virtual power plant agreement that PG&E and Sunrun have. So I think they're different in that the New Hampshire Electric Cooperative would be an agreement with individual ratepayers or people on the system, whereas the virtual power plant model that PG&E has with Sunrun is they're grouping together, I believe, literally tens of thousands of customers. So I think they're different. I am very interested in looking at whatever you can provide, though, and really appreciate that.
Yeah. So just a little bit of details there. In the New Hampshire program, we saw that out of the 85,000 customers, they're limiting it to 50 customers, and they did not give a megawatt limitation. So kind of small scale to start with, I'm assuming that was from a scalability standpoint. And then the Sunrun and PG&E, same thing. It's thousands of customers, but it's limited to a very small megawatt. 50 megawatts, I think, is what it is there as well. I might be misstating that, but nonetheless, it's a small amount of megawatts, small amount of load that they're trying to solve with that program. So we can basically, like say, try to proxy that, make that represent in our model, and then have good conversations about what the model results are telling us.
That sounds great. Thank you very much for doing that.
Absolutely.
Chris, I just had one question. In the case you're looking at for here, it talks about DERs generally with the 5% target, but are you looking at batteries only or behind the meter solar and batteries? there, and I guess this is a question to Jim as well. Is there a preference?
I believe both programs are only with systems that have batteries. So the idea being that the utility, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but the utility could then utilize the energy in those batteries as a dispatchable resource when wanted.
That's correct. That's correct. We could go deep into the weeds on that and spend, like Ben keeps saying, we could spend a day talking about what that would look like.
Sure.
But the system as it stands today is cheap enough for our customers that not a lot of our customers are looking to go out and buy a 10 megawatt battery for their house or a 5 megawatt battery for their
Right.
house. That would be, but we would look for opportunities to find cost savings from a program when you're looking at the large magnitude of build we're planning to do to transition our system. So Jay, I don't know if I answered your question, but I think it would be inclusive of just, go ahead, Ben.
No, sorry, I was just going to jump in and just say yes. I think the answer, Jay, to your question is going to be the DERs will be a combination of rooftop solar and behind the meter batteries.
Yes.
I don't have that mix right now. I've actually been doing some research this last week, and we've just been given a virtual power plant report from Brattle, the Brattle Group. Jim, I'm not sure if you've seen that in the past. Just trying to go through and trying to work out what that mix of what percentage would be, essentially rooftop solar and what percentage would be batteries. But we're certainly going to try and have some sort of hybrid profile for the two.
Yep.
Sure. Yeah, just one more thing. Obviously, both those programs that we're talking about are pilot programs, and I think that would be the appropriate place to start. And one other quick point is that by having these kind of programs in place eventually, we believe that will then help to spur people to provide batteries on their systems and add resiliency to the system and make it more cost effective.
Understood. Ben, anything else on this one?
No, nothing for me. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, thanks.
Perfect.
Jim, you're all set?
I am good. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks.
Okay, is Michael on today?
I saw him, I think, just log in. So
Yep.
good timing.
Perfect. So we'll move on along to Michael's request. He had a couple demand response, time of use rates, but one of Michael's requests was to run a model which allows no cost demand response. This will enable SPS to back out the value of demand response on its system compared to other resources. Demand response should be available year-round, callable once per day, callable hours equal to 100, and callable at any time of day. This program should be incremental to any DR, demand response, in the existing forecast. Michael would like to see us do that with the existing PRM of 15%, planning load of 85%. That's the higher, less conservative planning load that we used. It's not the electrification, but it is one step higher than our financial forecast, planning load forecast. Base gas and market energy pricing, base transmission upgrade costs, and long storage duration of 100 hours. To quantify this one, Michael, we're going to propose to include 200 megawatts of demand response program using the parameters described above, your parameters, at no cost. SPS will then provide the PBRR savings associated with the program, and then we can have conversations beyond that.
Let's see, Michael, we saw. So I'm trying to get back up to the top here. If you logged in, you had a chance to review what they have here.
Yeah, that all looks good. I guess my only question here is which scenario they would compare it to determine the PVRR.
Ben, you want to take that one? I'm assuming we compare it to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Michael, essentially, we would essentially do, as you can kind of see in that blue box, the existing PRM, the planning load, base gas, base upgrade costs, and long duration. So we have that scenario run. We do not have that scenario run. We don't have the planning load, but we would run that scenario without the incremental DR. And then we would run that same case again. And this time we would include that 200 megawatt DR program. Now, what we know is going to happen, because we're modeling it at no cost, is it's going to reduce the PVRR. There's no way it can. So then we could go back and say, okay, with this this incremental DR program, the incremental PVRR savings are X, which if you calculate that back would be the equivalent of however many dollars per kW month. And then that would give you information to determine whether that was valuable for customers or not.
Okay, that's great.
Can I ask a question about this?
Of course.
Is this a question? Is this supposed to represent an actual demand response program option? I'm not aware of any demand response programs that meet these specifications of no cost and cobble every day and any time of day.
Not necessarily.
So,
oh, go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, let me take the no cost perspective, because I don't think we're saying the demand response program would be no cost per se. What we're doing is we're going to calculate the savings associated with having a DR program. Once you've quantified the savings, that then tells you what that value would be to the system. So you could then go to a customer, I'm just making up a number, David, don't quote me on this, and you could say, hey, the credit that you would get based on the benefits of the system would be $2, whatever it may be, $2 a kW a month. And then the customer could determine whether they want it to be on an interruptible program for that credit. That's all this would do. It's not literally saying there would be no cost. There would have to be it would have to be worth it for a customer. It's just identifying the savings. Now, in terms of the program itself, we have existing programs in place. We have potential new tariffs coming into effect or being proposed. We'll have to decide how accurately they reflect this exact scenario. But this would certainly be used as an information point for future DR programs.
Oh, okay. So I see. But in reality, especially interruptible load, you're probably only going to be able to call it, 10 times a year at most. But this is just quantifying the value of that. Okay, I get it.
Yep. A proxy for a discussion. Michael, did you have any follow-up questions for that?
No, not at this time.
Excellent. Okay. We'll move to your next request, time of use rates, model and updated load forecast, which reflects residential and small commercial load shift in response to dynamic rates, kind of a customer behavior modification with savings if you use power at a different time versus peak time. I recommend shifting energy from use from SPS's net peak period and into the overnight or midday period. So Michael, you're requesting that under the existing PRM of 15%. You'd like to see that on that high, low case, base gas and market, base network upgrade costs, and with existing technology, what we have today. So our proposal is simply to shift 5% of the New Mexico residential and small CNI cells in the 4 peak hours to off peak. So we'll just shave off the peak and move that to the shoulders to represent what this would look like.
And would that be the gross peak or the net peak you guys are proposing?
Gross peak. Ben, is that fair to say?
Yeah. Well, before I answer that, Michael, I just want to confirm, when you're talking gross in net peak, are we talking gross peak of renewables, or are you talking sort of gross peak subject to like transmission losses? Maybe just some clarification there.
Yeah.
I'm referring to renewables.
Okay. At the moment, our plan would be to do gross. I'm not sure, based on kind of the analysis we're doing now, how much difference it would make if we did gross from net. Maybe. Let me look into that, Michael. Let me see if it's going to be impactful or not. Our plan was to do gross. I can see why you would suggest maybe looking at network. I'm not sure if you're suggesting that, but why there could be a benefit in that. Let me look at it both ways here. How about that?
Yeah, I think our preference would be for the net peak of renewables. Obviously, if that can't be done, then we'll take it at gross.
Yeah, I don't think there's a reason why. The problem we got with doing net is you would have to know ahead of time what the resource portfolio looked like. But I think we could get close enough. But for order of magnitude, I think we can do net instead. And sorry, guys,
Okay.
I'm thinking this is a bad thing.
No, that makes sense. Good question.
And do you know, I guess, once you're able to have a little more detail, if you could let us know which hours you would propose to move the energy into?
Yep, we can do that. And Mike, just if we did gross, it's very easy to say, hey, we're moving from 5 p.m., 6 p.m., and we're moving them to 11 p.m., midnight. When you start doing net, those numbers could be very different. Sorry, Michael, but let's think about this, because I think here's the issue you've got is designing that tariff. Because when you start looking at net and you're looking in, it's going to be different every month. The time of use rate impact would be different in May than it would be in June. It'd be different in July. I think that would be an extremely difficult tariff to come up with. Let me think about it, Michael, and we'll send some clarification if you don't mind.
Yeah, and if it's worth touching base offline, I can chat with you guys, but it may be worth just looking at maybe a summer tariff at a minimum.
Okay. I think, Chris, for the purposes of this conversation, I mean, these are great questions, and these are exactly why we wanted to present these scenarios today to talk it through. So that's maybe a level of complexity we didn't think about, Michael. So let us put our heads together, come up with maybe a kind of a more defined approach. We'll circle back with you, and then we'll kind of give that back to GridWorks with the kind of the final recommendation.
That sounds good.
I guess I was just going to ask on the timing you need to resolve those questions, Ben. You have enough time to do the modeling.
Yeah, I don't think, Jay, this is a particularly complicated modeling question per se. I think we just want to understand the parameters. So I think we can reach out to Michael in the next, by the end of this week, and hopefully get that wrapped up. I don't see it delaying the modeling though.
Okay. Does that sound good, Michael?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And we will move, Michael, on to your next request, which is just simply an early compliance request to model an early achievement of decarbonization goals. This would mean 80% carbon-free resources by 2030 and 95% by 35 on a pathway to zero carbon by 2040. This would be in addition to the ETA, the RPS, which is it's 50% by 30, 80% by 40, and 100% by 45. So as Ben presented yesterday and some today, we touched on just in our base model runs currently we're at 76% renewable with battery energy storage in 2030, and we go to 87% by 2040. So we're pretty close to getting there. We can easily just set the parameters within the model to look at what the incremental cost would be to get to 80% or 95%, 80% by 30 as you're requesting, from 76 to 80%, and then to 95% by 2035, where we're already at 87% 2040. So we can run this just to see what that incremental cost will be to get to an early decarbonization. You were requesting that under the existing PRM, planning load, base gas and market pricing, base transmission costs, and inclusive of the long duration storage. So not a big challenge to do this one, Michael. So, any questions from the group?
No questions. Thank you.
So we'll
Chris,
slide on.
Chris, I don't
Oh,
have
go
a
ahead.
question. I just have a
Okay, thanks, Michael.
So I just have a quick clarification, and I'm 99% sure I know what Michael means. I just want to make sure everyone's in agreement. When we talk about 80% carbon-free resources, what we're really talking about, Michael, is 80% of energy being served by carbon-free resources, correct? I just want to make that clarification.
Yeah, this was like an accelerated RPS.
Yeah. Okay, just wanted to make that clarification, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ben. Okay. Hey, we'll move on to your request with Wärtsilä. You're requesting to add reciprocating engines as candidate resources. We're to assume 3 engine increments, 56 megawatts, as that's the where the economies of scale kick in on the balance of the plant. You will provide in a separate email the CapEx, OpEx, physical parameters we'll need to model this. You say you'll also provide sub-hourly credits for battery reciprocating internal combustion engines, which is RICE, and combustion turbines, which is CT, which will be in dollars per megawatt hour. This should be added as a negative BOM or variable operation, or variable O&M, excuse me, and should have the appropriate impact on the capacity factor of the units. Alternatively, you can provide a fixed dollar per kilowatt year adder. We've calculated these credits in Plexos using an SPP node in Carlsbad, New Mexico. As for in-state, you can provide a rough CapEx for a hydrogen conversion in 2044 or whenever you want to do the conversion. I assume you'll have a price forecast for the cost of the hydrogen fuel. So yes, and just to share some details, you're asking for an increased PRM 18 to 20% under the planning load, base gas and market, $400 a kilowatt for transmission network upgrades, and inclusive of the hydrogen conversion. So yes, this would be in that level 3 hydrogen case. David, I think we mentioned this in our first discussion, our first face-to-face discussion, that we can include these recips as candidates for the model to select. So that should not be an issue, and we can certainly do that within the hydrogen space to give it that hydrogen pathway. So Ben's already kind of presented on the flavor of a resource that's going to be needed when we allow gas to be built. So within those spaces, that's where these RICE engines could be selected by the model. So yeah, no issue with this. Any questions you might have for us, David?
No, as long as it's clear to you, and I've already sent you the supporting data. I think I owe you, I may need to tell you the conversion costs of hydrogen, which is admittedly a bit of a hand wavy number right now, but I can provide that if you need.
Yeah, what we plan to do for the hydrogen cost is to use the EPA estimate. I believe it's $1 a kilogram or $8 at MMBTU as our proxy for hydrogen fuel cost.
Yeah. I mean, assume that elsewhere you have invested in the pipeline and other infrastructure needed to get the fuel. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I just have maybe one clarification just as I'm reading this again, Chris and David. I think we're comfortable running this scenario. I'm probably going to do it as 2 separate scenarios, David. I want to do it with the sub-hourly credit and without the sub-hourly credit. And I'm not saying that's because I dispute the logic. I understand where you're coming from. I just want to have an analysis that includes kind of a third-party assumptions, and then an analysis that does not include third-party modeling assumptions, just to keep it clean. So we'll kind of do a 1A and a 1B approach here. But we certainly can provide the information you're requesting.
Yeah, well, that's in my view even better. It gives you more information, so.
Yeah.
Sounds like everyone's in agreement.
Yes.
David, sounds good.
Awesome.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks, David. Again, appreciate you guys submitting this request. So we'll move into ExxonMobil's request. This is one where we've kind of got one request with a couple of parts to it. I'll quickly read through it and then just summarize what we're taking, what we're hearing ExxonMobil requesting. So they'd like to include the load demand information out to 2040 for the SPS territory provided by the Permian electrification study added to existing assumptions on other customer growth. You'd like us to present the load estimate data out to 2040 broken out by general customer groups, not necessarily rate classes, but large industry customers, residential, transportation, electrification, data centers, crypto mining, et cetera, et cetera. So just to zoom in on that, do we have James with us today? James Hall?
Yeah,
I
you
saw him
do.
here.
Good,
Yeah.
good morning, Chris.
Hey, good morning. So I think you heard yesterday that our electrification forecast, load forecast, is inclusive of that expected growth. This electrification emerging technologies load is inclusive of that expected growth. I can't speak to the details of that, and I don't know that Ben can either, but that load case would be representative of this Permian electrification study.
Yeah,
Is that a fair understanding?
yeah. My only comment is, you know, when I think you're working with S&P maybe to get some of the extra granular details, and that's good. I hear I guess it's not a concern, but the comment is I hear the statement around building in the Permian electrification data, you know, into what's sort of presumed to be a high side case, is one way it's been described. But, you know, when I talk to the oil and gas companies that we work with, it's really more of a base case for them and a kind of, you know, average expectation, right? Because of external commitments in their company plans. And so it's still not clear to me how, even if you model a high side case as it's been described, how that sort of materializes in the real world to be able to meet the growth coming forward if the RFP and the plans are more predicated on the, you know, the financial or the planning basis rather than the electrification basis. And I know we're not going to solve that here, but I'm just putting that placeholder out there that that's the driver for the request, right? Just to kind of reiterate the fact that we believe this load demand is coming.
Yeah, and this is Kerry Stanley with Target Resources. Just to kind of add on to that, a lot of that load growth from the S&P study is being driven by the EPA and New Mexico regulations that are being enforced on the oil and gas industry. And so that's a thou shalt do this, and not just being driven by the oil and gas companies wanting to do it.
Understood.
Yeah, so James, I'm not sure I'm going to fully address your comments or concerns here, but let me just kind of lay out what I think my intentions are here. Is you're right, we have been referring to it as a high case, and you know, I think as I've been doing that, that's just to kind of distinguish the load forecast that we're presenting today and just kind of how many resources are going to be included with each. Or I'll try and be a little bit more careful with my words going forward. But we plan on kind of having this, you know, is our higher bookend. And we still do think it's somewhat of a high estimate, not so much of the load, but just because it's my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you know this study a lot better than I do, but it really doesn't capture the expectation of behind the meter generation. So even if it says you're going to need, 17 gigawatts across the Permian, that's including behind the meter generation from large C&I customers. So we may not be necessarily serving all of that as SPS. And I know obviously that's Permian wide and not just our service territory. But when we come to issue the RFP next year, we'll have kind of these, as I keep describing them as bookends. And one bookend would be to fully address the entire Permian electrification study. So we will have enough resources on that bookend to fully serve our portion of the Permian Basin. And then I think then it's a case of going back to the customers and to other stakeholders and saying, hey, this is the cost of procuring these resources. And I think that gives you guys information that you need to determine kind of what level of comfort stakeholders and commission staff have in order to procure those resources. So I don't think our intention is to say, hey, this is the electrification study, this is the highest end possible. I think we intend to issue an RFP where we potentially could procure the maximum amount of load we're seeing across our system. Does that make any sense, James?
Yeah, it does. But no, I mean, I think as always, you're taking a very pragmatic approach, Ben. Right? You can only move forward on a risk basis, and with the unknowns of the behind the meter contributions and the timing, that's all you can really do. So I think you have a good pragmatic approach, and then as we move forward, right, we'll get more clarity and any additional gaps that are still out there, we can develop plans to meet those gaps. So no, I think that makes a lot of sense, Ben.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, James.
Perfect. Okay. James is probably not trying to put words in Ben's mouth, and as we've heard today, that resource planning can be boring, but it's this load forecast that's going to make it somewhat not as boring, as you're well aware. Okay, so we'll just dive into the two particular requests that you made. You'd like to see a model that demonstrates a pathway to 84% renewable deployment for SPS grid by 2030, per outward-facing document that Excel has presented in the past. For the electrification increased load model. So you'd like to see us to get to 84% with that expected load growth in the Permian Basin. External customers are basing their own future emission reduction targets and pathways in part on estimating the future carbon intensity of the grid. For example, the SPS grid. Understanding the pathway and likelihood of 84% renewable by 2030 for the SPS grid is important for customers with emissions targets. July 6th material showed 88% renewable by 2030, not for the increased load anticipation with Permian and oil and gas production, electrification, and other potential load growth. So this ties exactly to what you and Ben were just talking about. We'll have to set the goalposts, run the model, and look at the system that would need to be built to get to 84% and have conversation.
Yeah, and again, just to clarify, it's not the 84% number that matters. That's just an external reference that we came across. It's just more that as the note says, companies and stakeholders have their own targets, and they have to assume a certain carbon intensity of the grid and how certain that is. And then if they have to go above and beyond, what is going to be provided, then that's the sort of planning basis that's used, right, for leverage in addition to sort of other internal investments. And so it's just really getting clarity and certainty on if there is an expanded load, what will that number be for renewable or low carbon penetration by 2030, and then that clarifies what additional above and beyond activity folks have got to do depending on their own internal targets. And so I think we're all on the same page there.
Yes, sir. So Ben, just thinking about this one, since the base case that we've run with just today's technology being 76%, but today's technology without gas, 76% renewable by 30 and 87% by 40, would that be the best case to force, run it with that emerging technology, that electrification load case, and just look at a comparison between those? and then force on an additional percentage to see early achievement of decarbonization?
Yeah, I think, Chris, with this case here particularly, we may not need to run this case, because what I'm feeling is if the base case doesn't capture these requirements, just the kind of the economics case,
Right.
I feel like Michael's accelerated carbon reduction case that we presented, 3 slides ago or whatever it was,
Right.
I think that's going to probably give you the same results. So what I would suggest here, Chris, is we look at the base case, we look at the early compliance case, and then if there's a requirement of a third case, we can absolutely run, additional percentages or additional renewables kind of forced into the model, and then kind of meet, to James's point, I don't think the number itself is really what we're trying to get at here. I think we just need to be able to say to James and to other parties, hey, this is what we're going to be percentage of renewables in 2030 based on purely economics. And if we wanted to top up from, say, 75% to 80%, these are the actions that we're going to need to take. Here's the incremental cost. And then here's some solutions. Perhaps it's maybe some sort of like voluntary program that, customers can enter into to top up from 75 to 80. So I think if we can just kind of spec out a few different scenarios and then different solutions to provide stakeholders, I think that would work.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. I mean, as efficient, want to be as efficient with your time and resources as possible, right? And so I think you're right, and we agree.
Perfect. Okay. And then we'll just slide on to the next part of the request, James. A model that embraces industry-leading hydrogen deployment and carbon capture and sequestration. That's that CCS that we talked about. What you'd like to see is all new source facilities, including Texas, given the recent 88th legislation session, incentives having the ability to co-fire with 50% low greenhouse gas hydrogen by volume by 2033. You say it's technically feasible today, and 2033 incentivizes hydrogen producers with certainty due to current IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is inclusive of production tax credits, investment tax credits, etc., expiring in 2033. The source of hydrogen models should be lowest cost and low carbon based on the known practical cost assumptions for hydrogen generation, transportation, and turbine facility upgrades, and not preferential to any specific color, i.e. green, pink, or blue. So just to chat about this one a little bit. As we presented or been presented yesterday and a bit today, we've got that category of firm and dispatchable energy that the model, the base model, the economic model picks up. So it's in that space, James, that we feel like that, trying to get to it, this space in here that we can impact, or we can add a hydrogen path to, and that's what essentially we're doing in that hydrogen scenario, that model, that level 3 model that we've been talking about here. So we're going to essentially have a proxy for what that would look like in this load profile, this energy profile, but to have an early adoption of hydrogen to 50% by 33, we can certainly do without issue. We would just need to incrementally or just add that constraint to the resources, the firm and dispatchable resources the model has to select from. And if the model selects it, it automatically adds the 50% blending by 2033. So we'd set the model to say, burn 100% natural gas up until 32, and then switch to 50% natural gas, 50% low greenhouse hydrogen in 33, and just go from there. And then we can look at what the incremental cost would be for that case. And you would like to see us do that in that emerging technologies, that electrification of the Permian Basin. So not an issue to do this. I think that given the conversations we've had to now, we've got better understanding of what this could look like. So The cost of hydrogen that we would use is similar to what I mentioned to David earlier for those recips, those RICE engines, is the dollar per kilogram, the $8 per MMBTU that the EPA is estimating for hydrogen.
Very good. Yeah, no, that sounds good. I know we're trying to get some reference data on CapEx and so forth for new builds and steam turbine and gas turbine conversions as well that we can share in case helpful. But yeah, no, that sounds good. Appreciate the consideration.
Absolutely. Yeah, any of that data you guys can share as soon as possible, the better. We do have some data sources from our OEMs, Siemens, GE, Mitsubishi, those sorts that can give us some of those gas conversion costs to go to a hydrogen burning machine. And of course, as you heard, David's going to give us the same sort of information for the Wärtsilä engines. So any data point would be helpful. And then finally, existing natural gas-based generation facilities blending 30% hydrogen by 33, or existing natural gas facilities considered base generation retrofitted with carbon capture and sequestration by 33 based on optimized cost. We've had some rounds of conversations between us around this. I think that there's more to be discussed over the next week or so to further scope this, as we've clarified to ExxonMobil and others. Our existing gas steam fleet is on the trajectory to retire, the lion's share to retire by the end of this decade. And we've had some conversations around optimizing those retirement dates to Cynthia's point to try to mitigate rates. So there's some conversations that we could have around what units that are existing today might be good units to consider adding carbon capture sequestration, or to add a hydrogen blend and maybe build a generic model resource, say like a 2-on-1 combined cycle that the model can select from that has a carbon capture and sequestration system included into that particular model for the Encompass model to select from. See what the model does. If it doesn't select it, then we can go again, force the model to pick it in a certain date, and then see what that PVRR delta is, and say, have a conversation around what we've talked about. Does this add additional benefits to the system, the diversity that we've talked about, some of that qualitative conversation that we need to have around the diversity of the system? Does it make sense to do something like this because incrementally it only adds X amount of dollars versus not doing this, and then we have some risk exposure? So lots of words to say. Happy to do this one as well. But again, we'll need to have a couple of downstream conversations to further scope this so that we're representing something that makes sense for both you and SPS's existing fleet.
No, that's good. And I guess my last comment then would be, I agree with what you've said. I mean, the request is really just to help understand the diversity of supply question, right? And what is that qualitative resiliency? But we recognize as well, there's a lot of practical realities. There's a big difference between arm waving and ideas and you know, what actual facilities it makes sense to even look at. And that's obviously the experience and the understanding you have. So happy to have those conversations and help where we can and be flexible where we can. And again, appreciate SPS thinking about these requests.
So thank you, and Exxon for submitting the request and working with us. Jay, any questions from the team?
No, I think sounds like you and Exxon are, you know, in agreement on what to do next. There were a couple of questions in the chat from Cynthia looking at, and these were, I think, clarifying questions on some of the comments that came up during this conversation.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know if we wanted to hold those to the end or if we want to take those as the subjects come and go. So happy to answer anything that we've talked about thus far.
Yeah, I think now's the appropriate time, Cynthia, if you want to ask get 2 questions here.
Okay, thank you. So as I understand it, James, or the reason for the early compliance run request is because the oil and gas industry in New Mexico has emission compliance targets, right?
Not that I wouldn't, Cynthia. I wouldn't describe it as the sort of sole reason. I mean, obviously there are, compliance considerations, but this is just more generically as industry and our company think about how to best decarbonize as quickly as we can for oil and gas production. What scenarios are out there, and what are the implications of moving at an expedited pace. So I think this is probably in advance of purely just compliance driven activity.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, that's helpful. And then based on that, Ben, what I understood you to be saying is that there would be not a cutoff point, but in the analysis, say with the high load electrification, then potentially any additional oil and gas load on top of that, you would be looking at behind the meter contributions, or we'd be having that discussion?
No, I think, Cynthia, to clarify that point, when we look at the electrification and emerging technology case, in that case, we're going to include all of the additional oil and gas growth or electrification within the Permian that we would be required to serve. So the case that we would be modeling assumes that SPS is serving 100% of that load within our service territory. What I think is likely to happen is some of the large C&I customers are going to build some of their own behind the meter generation to fulfill some of that load. Now, the tricky part we've got, and we spoke about this in a previous meeting, was I don't think the large C&I customers quite know how much generation they're going to build, when they're going to build that generation. So I think from our analysis, we will assume we are serving 100% of the load in our service territory. And then the likelihood in the future is some of that load is probably going to be actually self-served. But until we can quantify that, we'll move forward with kind of the higher end assumption.
Okay, that's where I thought we were at on that topic matter of utility serve versus behind the meter. And that then is why I backed off on asking for a stakeholder sensitivity on that, because we didn't have enough information and data. And I think I specified that we'd like to see that as a study item for the action plan period, to really come up with some good estimates and data on what could be the behind the meter, and then what possible additional regulatory, carrots and sticks might help that along.
Yeah, so I mean, we certainly are open to model like an assumption of large C&I behind the meter generation. I just feel like the last conversation we had is we really didn't have, or our customers didn't have a good feel for exactly how much generation they could be looking at. So that's why we kind of suggested this high bookend approach, where we stated for our RFP purposes, we're looking to fulfill the whole amount of the load coming on the system. Reality, obviously, when we come to then identify the resource portfolio, file for CCNs, etc., that we may end up asking for something lower than our 100% request based on feedback that's developed between now, the RFP, and filing the CCN. So I think that information is going to probably be coming out pretty quickly from the large C&I customers. I just don't think they're ready to provide that information before we need to complete this modeling.
No, I think that's great. And then on the cost data of hydrogen, I appreciate that you all are going to be sharing back and forth, and the sooner that stakeholders or PRC staff could see that data would be really helpful for us. And then on the co-firing of 50-50 hydrogen and fossil, some sort of analysis or information as to technology ready to go to 100% in the future would be helpful.
Okay.
Yep, we'll present that at the end of August, and we will, if there's anything in the meantime, Cynthia, that we can provide. I'm going to touch on Sierra Club's request, which I've highlighted here on the EPA assumed price for hydrogen, which is what we're using. Anything beyond that that you'd be interested in seeing, let us know, and we can get you some data.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Okay, so Jay, just time check. We've been going for about an hour and a half, I think. Do we need to take a break? I've got one last request, Sierra Club. There's multiple parts to it, but I can summarize it fairly quickly. I just want to be respectful to the agenda and what you guys have laid out.
Oh, I think if you think this will be quick, and I haven't seen the Sierra Club representative here, so I think that's another question.
Okay.
Margie, what do you think? We take a break or try and finish this off? And
We're scheduled for a break at 10:45. So let's use this 10 minutes to go over the Sierra Club comments and input from the group, and then we'll take a break.
Challenge accepted. Okay. Perfect. All right. So by and large, Sierra Club's request has to it's the foundation around the proposed EPA 111 rules. These are cross-state air pollution rules that are proposed, that are out there, that are that are getting commented on within the industry. Not sure what's going to happen with these rules, but they're out there. So we understand them. Sierra Club understands them. So Sierra Club would like to see us go ahead and model model what it would look like if those rules did become implemented and required. So that's the summary of this. If you're interested, you can go out and just Google EPA 111. There's some nice presentations that pop up that give you a very good background or understanding of a high level of what these rules are intended to do. 111B, I've got highlighted here on the screen, is for new generation resources, and 111D, Delta, is for existing generation. I'm going to just quickly go through Sierra Club's request, and then I'll circle back and touch on what these mean, what these rules mean for existing, for XLs, for SPS's current fleet and future fleet. So they would like us to include sensitivities for EPA compliance, sections 111B beta, 111D delta, regulations for new and existing electric generating units is what EGUs, with the following considerations. Just to clarify, I did not correct, and I'm hoping not to step on any toes, but I think we have it backwards, or Sierra Club has the rules backwards. It's to no avail, but just it's not an impact here. Just to be clear, though, 111B is for new generation, 111D is for existing generation. But they'd like to see us consider these rules impacting Tulk, because Tulk plans to retire in 2028. No controls would be required, but the model should limit those units to their current emissions rate through 2028. They'd like to see us apply the rules to Harrington, because Harrington plans to convert to gas by 25. I believe that's actually 24. But anyway, the unit should, no, that's right, 25 into 24. The unit should be modeled to include 111B. There should be 111D limits for existing gas plants. And then furthermore, for the existing fleet, they'd like to see us Jones, our units in Lubbock, they want us to clarify whether Jones will continue to operate past 32, and if so, whether this facility would exceed the 300 megawatt threshold for existing units under 111B. So we've had subsequent correspondence with Sierra Club. We've clarified that Jones, particularly Jones 3 and 4, are our existing combustion turbine units. They are less than the 300 megawatt threshold, and they're less than what the EPA is considering a net capacity factor of approximately 50% as a threshold. We are less than that, so those two units, Jones 3 or 4, again, are not impacted by proposed rules. Furthermore, with Harrington converting to a natural gas steam generator, it would not be impacted by the 111 rules, 111 Delta rules, as it is an existing gas plant. And it's under the rule, but there's very, very minimal impacts from the rule. Essentially, the rule says just to continue to maintain the units so that emissions do not increase. And that's, of course, what SPS does with its fleet. And then, of course, with Tulp retiring in 2028, it would not be under the rule because the rules implementation dates are further out. I believe they're in they're later this decade, not 28. So the existing fleet, and I'll touch on this a bit more, is not necessarily impacted by the rules. They're covered by the rules, but they're not impacted by the rules. Let's talk a little bit more about new gas generating plants. The 111.
So,
go ahead, Ben.
Sorry, just before we move on to the next slide, I just want to check with Josh and just make sure he's okay with kind of the synopsis you just provided.
I haven't seen Josh in the list of participants here. Correct. Certainly, please chime in if I'm wrong. So I think, Ben, we're going to have to, confirm this in a subsequent email / call.
Okay. Apologies.
Yeah.
Sorry,
No.
Chris.
No, you're fine. I appreciate that. It'd be nice to have that conversation now, but I believe that's the understanding we walked away from in our conversation last Friday. So I certainly we'll take the fall or the fault if I misrepresent something, but we will follow up with Sierra Club and make sure we have the same understanding then. Perfect. Okay. So moving on, just real quickly, there's a lot to consume here. I'm going to summarize it. And again, you can Google the 111 rules and just kind of digest from a high level of what those rules propose. But essentially, they break the new existing or new gas plants down into 3 categories, particularly what we call combustion turbines or simple cycles. They break them into 3 subcategories: peaking, intermediate, or base load. If it's a peaking unit, which means it's an annual capacity factor or less, 20%, then that unit would be required to burn natural gas and natural gas only. If it's an intermediate plant with a net capacity factor between 20% and 50%, it would be required to start burning 30% low greenhouse gas hydrogen by volume by 2032. Or in 2032 by 2033. If it is a base load plant, then there's 2 pathways that it would be required to take. It would be in a base load plant would be anything above a 50% net capacity factor. It's got 2 pathways it can select. It can go down the hydrogen pathway, which is 30% hydrogen by 32 or 96% hydrogen by 38. Or you can go down the CCS, the carbon capture and sequestration pathway, which is I believe it's 90% CCS by 2035. Those are the 2 pathways that those rules, if implemented, would require the units to comply. So what we would plan to do to model this is for our generics, for our generic CTs, for a generic combined cycle, we would set these parameters up for our gas path under that level 30 that we've been talking about. I'll switch back to it real quick. Here in this hydrogen conversion, our gas fleet would be modeled with that hydrogen 30% by 32, 96 by 38, and have those 2 cases run to replicate what that rule impact would do. So again, high level summary of what all this says: 3 subcategories: peaking, intermediate, base load. If it's a peaking unit, we would just have natural gas, but due to the ETA, right, due to the renewable portfolio standard, we have to have a unit that has a carbon-free path, and that hydrogen path would be the one, or that carbon capture and sequestration path would be the one that we would take to try to do the evaluation, do the modeling on to understand what that carbon free or carbon neutral path would look like. Finally, just to summarize, they've kind of detailed what they'd like to see in these scenarios here. Optimization period: when modeling retrofit costs in future years, the run should be set to full optimization so that the modeling can see the future these future costs. If you need to run the model with a shorter optimization period for runtime constraints, the future retrofit costs should be levelized so that the future costs are considered during the capacity expansion decision. So Ben, I'm going to kind of punt to you on this one. If you could just kind of clarify for the team, you speak modeling much more fluent than I do, what exactly Sierra Club is looking for, because they're very fluent in modeling as well. If you don't mind, Ben.
Yeah, I think all they're trying to say here, and I'll be honest, I haven't spoke with Josh directly on this with Debbie. What I think they're trying to say is when we look at the optimization of costs, in other words, when we're calculating the PVR for each portfolio, when we're selecting the resources, we want to look the full 20 years and beyond when we're calculating those costs. In other words, you don't optimize the costs over a shorter period of time, say 5 years. And in fact, we're optimizing over the entire planning period. I think that's all they're trying to say, which is what we do anyway. So this is a particularly difficult request.
And then as far as modeling hydrogen, we've stated it thus far. I don't know that we've stated it in any particular terms that we would assume that the hydrogen would be what Sierra Club calls exogenous, meaning we don't generate it ourselves. There's a pipeline that brings this gas to our fence. We get the gas to the turbine and we mix it with the natural gas at 30%, 96%, 100% to get to the end goal of a carbon-free or carbon-neutral resource. So again, just to be clear, we would assume an exogenous supply of hydrogen based on the EPA assumed pricing of $1 per kilogram, which is around $8 an BTU. And then finally, for modeling the carbon capture and sequestration, they would like us to include capital costs of retrofit, incremental fixed O&M and variable O&M, include parasitic load assumptions, EPA assumptions, approximately 11% of the result, FOM, heat rate, which is fixed O&M, heat rate, and variable O&M needed to be scaled or need to be scaled. And they would like us to include the IRA tax credits, which we would do. We're still working on building out our CCS. We've got some recent information from an O&M that's come and visit with us to talk about this. We've got some data points that we could get from the market. Obviously, there's some data points that ExxonMobil has offered up for carbon capture and sequestration, as I believe they've got some experience doing this. So still a little bit more discussion around CCS, but ultimately what we would do in our generics is, again, on that combined cycle, model it with the back-end carbon capture sequestration back-end, inclusive of these cost streams, the upfront CapEx and the ongoing OpEx to represent what that could look like. If the model doesn't select it in that level 3, then we would force the model to select it and have a conversation around the PVRR. So that's me quickly trying to run through Sierra Club's requests and some of the constraints they'd like to see with their request. And I'll pause there for questions and passing the mic back.
Chris, thanks for summarizing that. Just to be clear on the status with the Sierra Club, sounds like you guys spoke last week, but you're still working through the details and need to finalize and kind of get their agreement.
Yeah, we're on the same page. The hydrogen page is clear. The carbon capture and sequestration, Excel SPS still needs to do a little bit of homework to get the carbon capture inputs, if you will, built for the model. But that's really not the Sierra Club's input. We're gonna have some back and forth with Sierra Club to say this is what we think it is. Any comments, but then ultimately we would lock those into the model and then hit run. So just to clarify, on the same page with hydrogen, carbon capture sequestration, we've got a bit of work to do to get the model built. But go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, sorry, Chris. Is it fair to say, kind of from a high level, these are the scenarios the Sierra Club want to see? We've probably got them refined now and defined. We're just really working on the inputs and assumptions now to fulfill those requests. Is that a fair statement?
That is absolutely fair to say. Just kind of by virtue of doing the hydrogen conversion level 3, Ben, we're covering Sierra Club's request, but there may be some details there that we need to just make sure we're checking the box on to represent what Sierra Club's asking us to represent.
Okay,
Are you
Oh.
gonna develop assumptions around cost of CO2 transportation and pipelines and sequestration storage within that? And have an assumed place where it's stored?
Yes. David, we're going to have conversations that we haven't had yet around what we're going to do. Are we going to sequester the carbon? Or are we going to assume there's a market for it that meets the intent of the ETA? So currently it would be sequestration, and assuming that we could somehow store it within the region.
Okay, makes sense.
Lots of assumptions, obviously, David. And just to kind of touch on that, this is why we're talking about the existing commercially economically available technologies today and comparing that to these emerging technologies. The what did you call it earlier, Ben? The unicorn technology that's going to solve this future need. But doing these sorts of scenarios, these great thought through scenarios that the stakeholders are throwing out, allows us to have those conversations about some of these emerging technologies that are on the horizon, to have good conversations around that and maybe get better understanding of what those technologies can be. So that way, when we continue this IRP process, we'll have a continuation of growth and understanding of what these technologies are, what they can do, what their limitations are.
Yeah.
Move forward. So.
And you know what, when it comes to the hydrogen piece, I think you could argue, and I would argue, that you also need to include the additional renewable resources in your portfolio to generate, to generate the fuel, right? Like you have to have it, like otherwise, I mean, I guess you kind of assume it's embedded in the cost of the fuel, I guess, but to be really transparent, I think you would include, in order to create the fuel we need for this unit, we actually have to add, X, Y, Z more renewables. And there's also the water, it takes to create the fuel, right? How much water is that?
Simply put, David, I agree with you. There's a lot of conversations that need to be had.
So Jay, if I could summarize where we are, sounds like this definition of the hydrogen conversion scenarios are affected by the input from Sierra Club and also ExxonMobil. It sounds like there's some follow-up to be done on those two stakeholder modeling runs that Ben and Chris and team will be doing. And there's one more follow-up on the time of use rates with Michael Kinney regarding the net or gross quantities there. So sounds like we've got sort of two main topics that will be followed up and hopefully in the next week or two, so that doesn't impede any of the modeling activity. It sounds like the assumptions for the hydrogen conversion and CCS run is something we ought to share with the stakeholders. There are a variety of people who are interested in that. So Ben and Chris, I'd ask that somehow we get a communication out to folks about how that set of runs are going to be done, what kind of assumptions based on information you've already presented, but summarizing it that reflects these stakeholder interests would be probably really helpful.
Understood. We'll take that as an action item.
Great.
Yep. Making a note here.
Great, thank you. Jay, is there anything else you want to cover here before we break?
I think we've used the time to cover all the topics that we had. I know there was one question in the chat here, and I think we can maybe I think we'll have to cover that another time, just keep on our agenda.
Great. All right. Well, we will, it's a 10:53 local time. Let's give everyone a 12-minute break and resume. Now it's only 11 minutes. Then if you need a cup of tea, we can extend it to 15. Is that sufficient for a cup of tea?
I can be quick. I'm good.
Okay. Well, let's resume then at 11:05 local time.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you all. Please resume the recording. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for tolerating a short break. Hopefully you had a little oxygen moving and blood flowing and a beverage of your choice this morning. And we have two topics remaining in our agenda. One is to report to all of you the results of the Little Priority Needs Worksheet survey that we thank many of you for completing last night, overnight, and this morning. Well, let me give a little context for this. Many of you know that we've had a small working group developing a statement of need input document, and that is available on the GridWorks website. I've posted that title of that file in the chat. That is quite a comprehensive document with a list of many of the considerations that stakeholders felt were important to consider in this 20-year plan. In addition to that, the survey that we launched yesterday is really intended to get a big picture priority set of needs from all of you, the stakeholders, such that those needs can be considered in an aggregate for the next set of decisions that the utility will make around their portfolios. So these two pieces of information will work in complement to each other. And I wanted to just quickly review the results of the survey that we got yesterday. We had 18 valid responses to the survey. And by that, I mean, we had a couple of responses that did not include name or email. And we have that data. We'll follow up with those the best we can to see if there are ways to get that input. But we felt it was important that a valid response would include the name and email, not for attribution to share with the group, but for us to validate that input came from an actual person who'd been involved in this process. So the 18 responses included 4 factors that we had not articulated in the survey. And you can see from the graph on the left that, not surprisingly, reliability and resiliency, 17 out of 18 respondents said that that was one of their highest 5 priority topics. Affordability for all customers, including small and residential customers, was the second highest rank of 13 people mentioning that as a priority need. Then third in this order, you'll see toward the bottom, investments in local communities was a very important criteria. You can see the subsequent number of votes for each of those priorities after that. So the idea here is to give you all a chance to comment on this. Let me read the other factors that 4 people listed as important were: 1, the ability to grow load following supply as demand increases due to electrification projects. There was one other on capacity and resiliency, the ability to handle electric vehicles, heat pump, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, water, etc., and distribution level resiliency with no single points of failure or dependence on the national grid. The third was, it might be interesting to see how this group responds to the priority needs, but the PRC staff looks at the requirements of the IRP Appendix A. I'll just note that that Appendix A was a factor in putting together this list of choices, but there were also some that were harder to characterize. So we will refer anybody who would like to look at that list from the IRP rule. Appendix A has quite a number of factors listed in it. And then the fourth suggestion was the support the development of the world and human growth with accessible energy through fossil fuel availability and cleaner energy than what is being used in developing nations. So those are some factors that are not captured in our categories, I'd like to pause here, and specifically if Jennifer Gresham is in the room, give Jennifer an opportunity to come off mute and describe her comments, her reactions, her thoughts about this set of priority needs and the tool. I know she had some additional comments that she wanted to emphasize. Jennifer, are you in the room and able to share your views with us at this point?
Okay.
Try that again, Jennifer.
I am here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I just thought in taking the survey last night that I think I would benefit from there being more definition around what these factors were. And so this would make sense to me, and I think that maybe we'll get more stakeholder engagement if we take like a second round and take like the top 5 or 6 responses and then put some definitions in and then rank order them. Because there was a lot of difference for me between what I thought was my number 1 and then my number 5. And I just thought that you know, from a stakeholder engagement perspective, that if we could, this seems like the best avenue for getting that kind of voice into this process. Just thought maybe another round of refining would be helpful.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, Jennifer, giving folks an opportunity to rank order these, giving some more definition and allowing stakeholders to rank order these is a legitimate suggestion. I think I would give the folks at SPS the opportunity to comment on how do they intend to consider or use this information, whether or not more granularity in the priority set would be helpful. I will point out that we have over 300 people currently on the distribution list for this process. And we've really appreciated those of you who've been engaging in the conversation in the meetings and in responding to tools like this and putting input into the statement of need. So I'm not sure if a mass kind of collection or request for information at that large of a scale would make sense, especially because of all of the context and the groundwork and the knowledge transfer that's been occurring through these meetings and discussions. So we'd have to take that into consideration, Jennifer, and decide how best to get more or different information that would be beneficial to SPS. And we at GridWorks will definitely follow up on this conversation with Zoe and Ben and Linda and Brooke and Mike and the team and Chris to see what might be useful for them from this point going forward. So thanks for the suggestion, Jennifer. Is there anything you wanted to say about which are if you had to give a rank order of the 5 needs that you listed, what the top ones and what the bottom ones are for you?
Well, I think maybe this is seems like a dangerous question to ask, because I'm not sure that I have the same, it's that lack of definition. That's my very question. And
okay.
So what if the way I'm interpreting reliability and resiliency, which I don't think I saw affordability in that. Well, it's affordability for all, and this seems like just making sure that I really understood those definitions. So anyway, that was kind of to my point. And Marcy, this is Zoe. You hear me?
Yeah.
I think providing stakeholders an opportunity to engage more in this process and to provide us with more information about what's important to them is integral to this process. So it is important for SPS to get that information. And I think it's important for the commission to get it as well, so they understand what was important to stakeholders and top of mind. So I know you asked how we would use it specifically. I'm not prepared to answer that question now, but providing the opportunity for stakeholders to rank the importance of like the top 5 or 6 of these, I think would provide a good level of information for us and for the commission as well. Thanks, Margie, for asking.
Great. No, well, let's follow up on that conversation after this meeting and think about how best to do that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer, for your comment and for speaking up. Are there any other comments about this list or the results or observations that you'd have about those? Anything people wanted to add? Okay, hearing none. Jay, is there anything that you wanted to add about this conversation?
I think the only thing I wanted to thank everyone for their quick responses last night. You never know how this is going to go, so I think that was helpful. And I guess, look, I think the whole idea here was to reach out, see what people think, give them opportunity to put their responses in their words instead of trying to develop, self-define it for them. And I think the team here will take this in and work with everyone on how to best make use of this feedback. And just again, thank you for your time and thoughts here.
Great, thank you. So let's go to the next slide, please, Deb. And we're here now we've had some great conversations over the past day and a half. We have some actions to follow up in terms of the modeling results, some definition in a couple of cases of the stakeholder modeling request, the stakeholder requested modeling runs. We have a follow-up here on the input to the needs of stakeholders. We're also planning to get back together on August 29th for a 4-hour meeting to hear the rest of the modeling results and to discuss what they mean to all of us, including the utility as well as stakeholders. So that is our focus for the next step on August 29th. As you recall from yesterday, we announced that we are extending that meeting. It was originally scheduled for an hour and a half. And it was clear to us that that was insufficient amount of time for having that modeling discussion. So we've extended it to a 4-hour meeting. Then we've added a meeting on September 13th from 1 to 3 p.m. to really begin to process that information into what suggestions people have for action plan or input into the action plan. And then we will wrap up that conversation a little over a week later on September 21st to conclude the discussion about input to the action plan. And that will be our final meeting in advance of the IRP being filed. And I think I have the incorrect date here. It says the 16th. The actual official date is October 15th. And I believe perhaps SPS will be filing that before that. I think the 15th is on a weekend, but that's the time frame for the submission of the plan. And then we will ask this group to come back one last time on October 26th to really hear your feedback on how did this process work over the past months, as it is a new process for the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission. And part of our report deliverable to them, which will be done in January, is to suggest best practices, to suggest things that could be done differently going forward. So that's our plan for next steps. Are there any questions about where we're headed and what's going to happen next? Questions, comments, concerns? Feel free to contact us if you have questions or concerns apart from this meeting or they occur to you. On the last slide will be how to get in touch with us. But before we go to that last slide, the next slide, please. We're going to ask for one more contribution of your time, and that is to give us feedback on how this meeting worked for you today. You can either scan the QR code on your phone here on the slide, or go to the link both in the chat or on this slide. We very much value your input on how to make these meetings most effective and how to factor these into the process. Also, your concerns and suggestions for improvement and how to make your engagement easier and more effective are greatly appreciated. So please take just a couple of minutes. Your name and email are optional on this survey. We don't need to know who you are. We just want the input so that we can act on it. Of course, you're free to provide your name if you'd wish. That's optional, but really it's the content that's really important to us. So I'm going to leave this up for a few minutes so that if you wish to use the QR code for the survey, I think it's only got less than 10 questions and with a multiple choice response. So we please ask that you provide that feedback. And while we're doing that, I wanted to give a great big thank you to all of you who are here over the past 2 days, tolerating the patience and offering your patience in this virtual platform, sharing your observations, your questions, your insights with us. They're very important. I also want to give a huge thanks to the SPS and Xcel Energy team that has put together so much great information, has presented it in a way that's accessible to the larger group, and gone above and beyond even in off hours when we try to resolve some questions in between our sessions yesterday and today. A huge thanks to that entire team for your contributions and sharing your knowledge with us. So with that, I think I'd like to give Zoe the opportunity for a last comment, if you'd like, before we close today's meeting. So Zoe, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Margie, and thank you to everyone who's attended in person and Hobbs and virtually. We really appreciate your engagement on this. And we're looking forward to for future engagement later this month. And please don't hesitate to reach out if anyone has questions, follow up, or otherwise. Thanks, Margie.
Great. Thank you, Zoe. And Deb, I think you can show the last slide, or raise your hand if you still need the QR code. Otherwise, we'll shift to the last slide, which is how to reach us. And you will, in the next day or two, see a written summary of this meeting posted on the gridworks.org website. We'll also have all the slides, materials, and a recording, a link to the video audio recording of this meeting in case you'd like to re-listen to any portions of the meeting. So with that, let me say thank you and to offer you a great rest of your day, and a thank you again for all your participation. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.